Hello, and welcome to another episode in the Think Digital Partners YouTube video interview series. Today, I'm delighted to say we have an expert on international travel document ID and verification. That's in the shape of Jon Payne from WorldReach Software. Good morning, John. How are you doing today?
Hi, Gary. I'm doing well. How are you?
Thank you, sir. I'm great. Thank you. I know we've got a number of interesting things to think about today. So let's start off just by understanding for people not familiar with you, what's WorldReach all about?
Sure. Yeah. So WorldReach is a software company. We're Canadian. We have a subsidiary in the UK as well.
Mhm.
And really, what we're all about is trusted digital services. So anything really in terms of the identity of the citizen, where the government and the citizen are doing business, that's kind of the space that we move around in. Particularly, the history of the company is in immigration, in passports, consular services, but really anything which is government to citizen. That's where we play.
A good example of this work, of course, would be we recently, I must say, with genuine pleasure as a journalist who's been covering government IT for far too long, perhaps, that we actually were able to record a bit of a black swan event, an extremely successful government IT project. That's in the shape of the EU settlement scheme. And joking aside, that's obviously a very significant achievement in terms of digital identity in the UK. Do you want to kind of give us briefly the picture there, John, about how your company helped?
Sure, yeah. So a brief background, probably familiar to people in the UK, maybe less so to others, is that just going back a couple of 3 years, when the UK made the decision to leave the EU,
Mhm.
there was obviously a lot of challenges out there for the government. And one of them on the immigration side was a really unusual thing that we hadn't seen the like of before for the Home Office, which was something between 3.5 and 4 million EU nationals who were already living in the UK and working there by virtue of freedom of movement that comes with the European Union. And of
Mhm.
course, that freedom of movement was going to go away. So the Home Office decided that they needed to register those people in order to be able to give them the new settled status that they were entitled to.
Mhm.
Uh, but they didn't want to do it necessarily by the old methods, which would have been a lengthy form, at the very least, sending important documents like your passport into the Home Office, hoping for the best in terms of getting it back, or
Absolutely.
even in some cases an in-person appointment. And
Mhm.
so they added an additional channel to the options that was purely digital
Yes.
and purely remote, and that's where we came in. So we provide a thing that's called IDV, the Identity and Document Verification Service, at the beginning of the process. And the purpose of that IDV process is for the citizen, in this case the EU national, to verify their identity with the Home Office at the beginning of that application process. And at the end of it, it's an important business because they're getting permanent settled status in the UK. And just recently, the latest numbers that I've got, Gary, is the Home Office just announced in the last couple of weeks,
Mhm.
3.5 million people have now been through that process and applied for the status. And you perhaps won't be surprised if I say the very, very overwhelming majority of those people chose that digital route over some of those more traditional routes. And the reason is it's simple to do. You can do it from home or from wherever you are. You don't need to go in to get an appointment with the government for any of it in most cases. And it takes, in terms of the intel that we've got, the data that we get out of the system, it takes most people, less than 10 minutes to do it. So that's the role that we play.
Many people involved in public sector IT on both the supplier and the buying side, John, would genuinely want to know why do you think this project was so successful? What kind of factors of success would you identify?
Yeah, that's a great question because, as you hinted before, not all traditionally, not all big tech projects have been, plain sailing. And
This one was a big scale as well, so that makes it even more.
yeah, this is big numbers,
Mm.
really, of the members of the public who have to navigate this thing. And I think so. There's a couple of things that I think I would say about the success. First of all, kudos to the Home Office because they have put an awful lot of the right resources and the right people in place and a lot of focus to make sure this thing was a success, right?
Okay.
So for example, it was not just a question of switch on some new technology and let's hope for the best. It was not just weeks, but literally months of beta testing with our team and their team and other folks involved in the greater team to, before it went completely live in the spring of last year. So
Okay.
there was an awful lot of preparation. But I think the other thing that I would say, and perhaps the biggest point in terms of the success is, look, this is not just about introducing a new piece of technology. It's about us and other industry folks with the Home Office working together on a new process. It's about innovating new process that works for the citizen, right, and is usable by the citizen. And the technology is not the point. The technology is a supporting player, a significant support in that process. But I think the reason why it's been successful is because the focus of everybody involved has been to get that process right.
It's going to be interesting to kind of, because there's some continuity in what we're going to be talking about in our conversation. So you've got big scale, you've got, and I notice that 3.5 million figure. I mean, we often find ourselves in digital identity compared to financial services, especially in the Nordics, John, which seem to be, the benchmark for many people in the community for successful ID take up. And it looks like some of the take up here was equivalent to financial services. That is pretty good.
Yeah, I think it's in many cases it's a lot better because we've got, as I say, the large majority of people choosing the digital route rather than these other traditional routes. Whereas, I mean, for example, not that long ago, there was a good intelligence report about this stuff, which is interesting, about this kind of process, the IDV process. And you'll see there that some of the numbers out of the financial services are a lot more difficult, i.e., in the financial services sector, very often you'll get up to 70 or 80% of people voting with their feet to go via another route because the digital route is considered to be too difficult or not convenient or whatever it is. So I think if you've got, 3 or 4 options and you have the majority, as we do in this EU settlement scheme, you have the majority of people choosing the digital route over the other routes, then I would say that that's probably more successful than many of the similar projects in the financial services sector.
You mentioned IDV a couple of times there, and I think that's quite an interesting central concept for what you guys are trying to do at large scale ID projects. So for people who aren't familiar, I'm sure they are, but let's just make sure, walk us through IDV, John.
Yeah, sure. So you're exactly right. IDV, just to be clear, means simply identity and document verification. So the concept is reading a document securely, for example, a passport or an identity card, matching that against the person using facial recognition. And another piece as well, which is a liveness test, which is essentially, is there a real person at the end of this application, and rather than some kind of spoof. And essentially the IDV service of the sort that we provide is a triangulation of those 3 pieces. And the reason that I think that's significant, Gary, in terms of the way that, government to citizen business, is because it gives you 3 really powerful pieces of data all tied together. Okay. One of them is this a genuine document? 2, is this a real live person? And right, as I say, not a spoof of some kind. Thirdly, is that real person the owner of that genuine document? Okay. And if you do this remotely and completely digital, without any in-person stuff, as I say, without even any documents being sent through the post and whatnot, it's a really powerful set of data if you can triangulate those 3, and then the government agency that's dealing with the citizen can have a really high degree confidence that they're dealing with the right person before the rest of the business continues. And that's the value of it, I think.
Now, as I understand it, you have decided not to rest on your laurels as a company, but you decided to take on not a very small, simple problem, which is rebooting the global economy. Not on your own, but you know what I'm saying. You think you guys have spotted a way to make air travel and international travel, I should say, perhaps a little bit easier as we move into recovery. And I think from if I understand your material, you see IDV as key to this. Would you like to unpack that for us? That sounds pretty interesting.
Sure. Yes. Well, certainly we're not going to be responsible for the recovery on our own, as you say, Gary. But I think that there is some important stuff going on around that we see because we spend a lot of time working with immigration agencies in different parts of the world, passport agencies, and so on. There is a real focus at the moment, I would say, on a couple of things: providing services that are remote and touchless.
Okay.
Remote, I mean, in terms of the travel sector, look, I think I'd say think about it in terms of the recovery this way, an awful lot of, in terms of getting back on our feet, economically speaking, that's part of that is going to be international travel returning, obviously. And I think that the success of that is going to depend to a large extent on whether we in the industry, whether the governments, whether the travel industry has dealt with the genuine concerns of the traveler, right? And I think one of those things is going to be, do I have to stand around in long queues with lots of other people? And then I think the other one is, do I then have to touch a lot of things like, for example, a fingerprint reader or a kiosk or something at an airport, just immediately after 100 other people just did touch the same
I'm
thing,
getting
right?
to you even saying that, to be honest with you.
Right. So, so I think that one of the things that we are seeing, as I say, in the travel industry and the immigration space is the demand for remote services and services that are touchless. And I think the reason that I'm raising that is because I think that the IDV approach that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago is both those things. It's both remote in the sense that I can submit my information before I leave home, even before my journey has started in the immigration, in the travel context. And if potentially in the future, and this is not available in many countries, but it's becoming popular now in the immigration world, if the check that happens at the border or another checkpoint is just based on facial recognition against all of the enrolled data that I already sent. Of course, there's no touch involved in that. So there's real potential, I think, here to reframe the way that we do what they call seamless travel in a way that deals with some of these pandemic-related concerns.
I don't want to be cheeky, John, but I could say maybe it's a bit of sort of chicken and egg thing here. No one's traveling though, right?
Right. Well, that's a fair point as of today. Although there's already some signs that we're seeing a little bit a few more flights coming back with some airlines now. What we will see in the second half of this year, I think, is a return to something like normal. And as I say, I think but it's not just enough clearly for airlines to bring back flights, etc. It's going to require the traveling public to have the confidence. And which is why I raised that point about, can we do things in a way that are remote a lot more often? Can we do things that are in a way that are more touchless? And if we can, I think that the traveling public will come back to their normal patterns of behavior much more quickly.
So you've got a tourism aspect here. You've got international business travel, immigration, of course, economies being open to new skills. These are all very important levers for the recovery.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's not, when we talk about particularly travel and tourism, for example, this is not a marginal kind of business, right? For most countries, the average country in the world has got, believe it or not, 1 in 10 jobs in travel and tourism, and probably are in the region for many countries of 10% of their whole GDP is around travel and tourism, right? And the thing I would say about that is that even what we see spending most of our time in that world, even before the pandemic, there was an awful lot of demand for these digital services. People are starting to see these kind of digital services in other parts of their lives. You mentioned financial services a second ago.
Yes, cool.
Increasingly, we're seeing a demand for these kind of digital services in the way that citizens want to be treated. And also, we're seeing government agencies realize the potential of doing things more efficiently. And that's before the pandemic. And so I think, for me, what we're seeing is post the pandemic, or coming out of the pandemic, I think we're seeing perhaps an acceleration of the demand for those things to be introduced.
What's really interesting about what you're saying to me is that I read a lot of stuff at the moment about how commercial sector, private sector is kind of accelerating and kind of retooling processes and digital transformation, perhaps an overused term, but the effect isn't. And kind of, how the pandemic and the lockdown has kind of accelerated that. Maybe you're kind of suggesting that a similar effect could be happening in a very big part of public sector work, which is, protection of borders, etc., and immigration, all that kind of great stuff. And you're saying perhaps, if I've got you right, John, that maybe we should take the opportunity here as well and kind of go digital.
Yeah, so look, I mean, absolutely. You're exactly right, Gary. And I think the first thing to say is nobody wants anything like the pandemic that we've just all been experiencing, right? And we're still going through. Clearly, that is not a situation that any of us would wish for.
Certainly my barber wants it to end, John.
Exactly, right, exactly. But I think that one of the things that we are beginning to see, we've seen quite a lot of already, all the way through the strange few months that we've been through, is exactly what you've just talked about, which is essentially an acceleration of the kind of innovation that would have happened anyway. And I think there was an awful lot of this kind of stuff that I'm talking about in the travel world. Seamless travel initiatives have been very, very kind of popular over the last few years. And I think there's an awful lot of government agencies and airlines and airports and all those folks who were considering introducing these kinds of digital services and digital ways of operating, perhaps in the medium term, right, over the next 3 or 5 years.
Yes.
I think you're exactly right. I think if anything, if the pandemic has any impact, well, it clearly has had an impact on that sector. One of the long-lasting impacts will be, I think, a more rapid adoption of digital ways of doing things, which would, perhaps in other circumstances, have been, in the medium term.
Tying it back to where we kind of started the conversation, then what I think I'm getting here is you're saying that you've proven an approach will be accepted by the public and will work at scale in terms of EUSS, and now as a use case, you're suggesting that the technology is there to sort of do, effectively fix another big problem, which is international travel as we emerge from lockdown. Have I understand your logic and your proposition here?
So I think the IDV approach, I think you have understood it, but I think it can apply to more than just travel, right? Just going back to where we started, just going back to fundamentals, right? If the government agency has confidence without seeing a person in front of them and without even receiving any paper documents from them, has confidence that here's a person whose identity is genuine and is tied to a document that the government has issued.
Indeed.
Like, or an identity card or something like that, then you could potentially, in terms of government to citizen business more generally, you can see the power of that. And of course, the pandemic concerns that we were talking about a moment ago don't just exist in travel, they exist in all parts of life at the moment, in terms of people perhaps wanting to do business digitally, being able to do more remotely at home, not having to stand in a queue, not having to go and touch things that the other folks in the public have been touching. All that's a lot of those concerns are around in everyday life in terms of other business that you might be conducting. And I think so. We believe that the IDV approach has got real value in all of these other bits of government to citizen communications as well.
So almost, like it or not, 2020 could see a big change in the digital ID world, and in terms of acceptance and public utilization of it.
I think it could be the catalyst for that, Gary. Yeah, because as I say, I think what the immediate future looks like is a more rapid innovation in terms of the deployment of digital services in a way that is secure. Can we securely be sure that the citizen is the right person that they claim to be?
Yes.
And that's remote in a way, i.e., can the citizen do it in a way that is convenient for them and doesn't raise health concerns and all of those things. So I do think that in the short term, we are going to see a fairly rapid deployment of those kinds of services across the government space. Yeah.
Interesting. My last question for today, John, is it's very much a question of the hour. You've been thinking a lot about this. You've been thinking about the future. You've got deep experience in government anyway, and you've got the commercial perspective. So I think you've got a good basis for some thought here. I think it's now banned as a cliche, John, but the new normal, life post-lockdown, life in recovery. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think it's going to be different, the same? I mean, are we going to find expectations going to be broken?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I don't want to go too far and wide outside of my bailiwick, but I do think that we've all seen, a very different kind of way of life, right? Where a lot of people have worked remotely, perhaps for the first time. A lot of companies are dealing with all of and schools and others are dealing with the implications of all that. And I think it just emphasizes really the point that we were discussing a moment ago, which is if people were beginning to demand, people in terms of the citizen, right, were beginning to demand digital service delivery before, there's no doubt that post the pandemic, that's what many folks will expect. They'll see the delivery of digital services, of remote working and remote ways of doing things. And I think that the citizen is becoming more educated about those options, and they see what's possible in one sector and they'll expect it to be delivered in another sector. And I think I think my answer to your new normal question is I would expect a rapid kind of development in the deployment of digital services for the citizen. And I think the other point I would say, Gary, which is good news, I think, is that it's not a question of having to wait for some new technology to be invented. The nice thing about some of the projects that we're working on, for example, the EU settlement scheme where we started talking, is the technology is already available to do it now. The experience is that you can do that in the real world in scales up very, very high to millions and millions of citizens doing this on their own. And if you put in the hard work, as I mentioned earlier on, to do the process reinvention carefully, it can work very effectively for millions of citizens. And so the good news is, in terms of the new normal, the technology is already there and it's already tested in the real world.
For the Think Digital Partners community who are, so focused on these important questions around not just ID, but digital public services, I think that's definitely food for thought, and I would say an excellent place for us to finish our conversation today. Unless there's anything you wish to add, John, I would point out to viewers that we will be sharing resources, both in the show notes at the bottom of the video and also some editorial on the Think Digital Partners site. Have you got any final words before we let you get on with your business day?
No, that's good, Gary. Thanks very much. Very nice to talk to you.
Nice to meet you, sir. Speak to you soon. Thank you.